Park, and excited about this lecture with Montgomery County Senior Historian Jamie Kuhns to talk about the life of and legacy of Josiah Henson. And if you didn't pick up one of our brochures in the back, it's got info about all of our upcoming events, including other lectures, film screenings, poetry readings, art openings. There's also a sign up for our weekly e-newsletter if you want to keep up with that. You can also go to the city's Facebook page or to takomapparkmd.gov/arts. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Jamie. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you. All right. Can everyone hear me? I feel like I'm always way too loud when there's a microphone in front of my face, so just let me know if I'm fluctuating. But thank you so much to the City of Takoma Park for having me here tonight to talk about Josiah Henson and how we're bringing his story to life here in Montgomery County. So back in October of last year, I had to do a presentation on Josiah Henson for the American Studies program from Georgetown University. And the professor that planned this field trip decided she wanted to bring the kids, and I say kids, these are undergrads, at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning to our site, which, that's prime time to ask an undergrad to go on a field trip. And she said, you should have an icebreaker prepared so they feel comfortable around you and they feel like they can ask you questions. And so I pulled this image up. And how many of you are parents in this room? Okay, I am too. So 7 p.m., 8 p.m., it gets harder to make your brain work. And I really appreciate you all being here. I know you've worked long days and this is kind of late. And I promise I practiced this and it should be under an hour. So if I'm not, Marilyn, you tell me like you're running over. But I love this slide because my daughter loves Legos, and I remember we watched the Lego Batman movie, and this scene came up, and I said, this is perfect for me, because my 3 greatest fears in life are snakes, clowns, and public speaking. So if I get flustered or tongue-tied or anything, you just know this is part of me. I've been a historian with the Parks Department for 10 years, and very little have I been asked to do public speaking. I've been, in my mind, very fortunate they've just let me do research, which is my bread and butter. But after 10 years, they're like, it's time for you to talk about Josiah Henson out to the public, so here I am. So I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with the site or where it's located at, so just to give you a quick discussion on that. The Josiah Henson Park is in what we call North Bethesda now. I've learned from Tony Cohen in the past it would have been called Rockville, so I don't want to offend anyone with the wrong terminology, so that's why I put them both here. It's located off Old Georgetown Road, and it is a National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom site, and we're very proud of that. The other day when I did the interview here, I realized some people have no clue about our agency or what we do here in Montgomery County, so I just want to quickly run over that so you understand how we're operating a county-owned facility. So our organization was established in 1927. We're a bi-county agency for the state of Maryland, and we basically activate public land in both Montgomery and Prince George's County. Now here in Montgomery County we have a planning department and a parks department, and within the parks department, which is where I work, the division that I'm under is park planning and stewardship. So the stewardship implies that we maintain and take care of natural and cultural resources. I threw this image in just I thought it was just kind of cool because I'm in Takoma Park and I very rarely get the opportunity to talk about Takoma Park, but I'm doing a presentation on parkways for another assignment. And this image is from the oldest planning document we have for our commission. It dates to 1931, and Roland Rogers wrote this. He was the original landscape architect for MNC PPC. And this was a plan for what you now call Bell Ziegler Park. And when I read it, and I talked to Marilyn about this today, I thought this isn't one of our parks. But in this document, it says that the town did ask the commission to take this park on. So somewhere through time, that handshake agreement fell through or something. So there's another research project that just popped in my head while doing this presentation. But I wanted to share that with you because this is an old diagram or plan of what they thought that park should look like. So within park planning and stewardship, the section that I am in is cultural resources stewardship. And there are 6 of us that are career employees, and we literally have 1 historian, 1 historic preservation planner, 1 museum manager, and 2 archaeologists, and 1 manager who supervises us, all of us. Keep in mind, in Montgomery County, we own 20% of land in this county. So anytime a new acquisition comes into our system, if it has an improvement on it, whether it's a house, a barn, a garage, it falls on our section to determine, is it historic? Is it worth interpreting? Is it worth preserving? And that's literally what we do: research, rehabilitation, archaeology, and then we interpret 8 to 10 of our best historic sites. And interpretation isn't necessarily just building a huge museum, because frankly, we don't have the budget to do that. It can be as simple as making an interpretive sign. So when you do come out to a barn, you know what it was in the past and what it was used for. So within that 20% of the land that we have here in the county, we have 43 different sites that are just in our inventory, and that includes over 111 buildings. Now, not every 1 in 11 buildings is a house, okay? So some of them are a corn house or a tobacco barn, but we do have a lot of homes. And we have a small budget. We have $300,000 a year to take care of all those buildings. So with that being said, that doesn't go very far. If you're a homeowner, you know that's not a lot of money. So we rely on our in-staff folks to do a lot of the grunt work for us. Our facility management guys help us work on the buildings to keep them up and running. We do rent out of a lot of our properties because frankly we need to have bodies in them to keep water running, keep the heat on, and we do generate income by renting out those properties. But we also do go out and get grants. And since I've been here in 2008, we've received over 20 grants. And this past year, we received a $50,000 capital grant for the Maryland Historical Trust, specifically for the museum, where we'll be doing the exhibits and the orientation film at the new visitor center. And if you are not familiar with this site down here, I want to point this out because I'm here for Black History Month. This is the Woodlawn Museum, which is in Sandy Spring. That was the first museum that we brought online. Meaning we didn't inherit it from a previous employee. It's when Cultural Resources started in 2008. And I literally started working on that in Henson at the exact same time. And if you're interested in the Underground Railroad, what it was for the enslaved as well as free blacks in Montgomery County in the antebellum period, go here. They have an Underground Railroad hike experience, and it's just a wonderful place to go. So if you don't have anything to do this weekend, I encourage you to go out there and check it out. So getting back to this site, the Josiah Henson Park today is about 4 acres, and when the county purchased the property in 2008, it was just the parcel that says Henson Park on it, basically. And that included the original plantation house. We've added to that over time, and so now we're up to 4 acres, and you can easily tell we're in suburbia. So it makes it a little bit challenging to get you back in the past and talking about the plantation when you're surrounded by buildings and cars. And we're doing our best to deal with that, but we also have noise off of Old Georgetown Road. We have parking limitations. I'll get into that more, but this is our site that we're working with. So talking about the house, this is what the Riley house looked like in 1919, and this is the oldest photo we have of what the house looked like at that time. And the Riley family still lived there then in 1919. They owned the house until 1926. And the lower picture is what it looks like today. And it has gone through some renovations. Most significantly, in the mid-1930s, the house was renovated by the owners into a colonial revival style. So they did remove some of the original fabric, and probably the most noticeable part between those two pictures is they removed the side porch. You can kind of see that triangle gable off the side of the house. That was a side porch, and that was the entrance and exit from the main house to go to the log kitchen. And the map that you're looking at here gives you an idea of what the plantation looked like in 1863. Now, at that point, Josiah Henson was not here. When Henson was enslaved on this plantation, it was over 700 acres. So it was indeed a plantation. It decreased over time, and by 1926, when the property was sold, it was down to 61 acres. And today, we're down to 4 acres. And this is the venue where we talk about this man, Reverend Josiah Henson. And we're really fortunate to be in the position that Henson wrote down his memory, and we have that primary resource at our disposal. Most people, when you go to a museum, for example, when I worked at Monticello, we had an overabundance of primary resources from Thomas Jefferson, but his point of view is from that of the master. Whereas here in Montgomery County, we have the opportunity to talk about what slavery was for the oppressed, the people that lived it, the men and the women and the children who had to endure slavery. And the image over to the left is the original narrative that Henson narrated. And I say that because Henson was still illiterate at the time the book was published in 1849. And in Maryland, literacy was not prohibited, but it was certainly frowned upon. So Josiah Henson did not learn to read and write until he was 50 years old, and his son Tom taught him how to read and write. So he narrated his story. It was published in 8 different editions in English from 1849 until 1890, and that was after he died in 1883. So even after he was passed, his story lived on. And of course, we know that there's a heavy connection to Harriet Beecher Stowe novel, The Uncle Tom's Cabin, and we'll get to that in the presentation. But in addition to the narrative, there's a lot of primary sources tied to Henson because he was in the media a lot in this time period. He was a very famous African American in this time period, and because of his ties to Uncle Tom's Cabin, he was frequently noted in the news, and we'll talk about that as well. So Josiah Henson was born in Maryland, but he was not native to Montgomery County. He was actually born in Charles County on a plantation called LaGrange, which is in Port Tobacco. Now, his mother was actually owned by Dr. Josiah McPherson, who also lived in Charles County, and he hired her out to Mr. Newman. So his father lived at LaGrange, and they had a family. They had, I believe it was 6 children. And they had a very short time together because eventually, unfortunately, probably the earliest, definitely the most traumatic early event in his life was his mother was being sexually assaulted by the white overseer at LaGrange. And his father decided the proper thing to do was to defend his mother. And striking a white man as a black person in this time period had major consequences. And so for what that meant for Josiah's father was he received 100 lashes, his ear was severed from his body, and then he was ultimately sold down south. And in this time period, if you were enslaved in Maryland, the greatest fear amongst them was being traded down south because they knew conditions on a tobacco plantation were significantly worse than they were here up in Maryland or Virginia. So after that occurred, Josiah's mother, as well as Josiah and his brother, went back to Dr. McPherson's plantation. And he didn't live much longer after that, meaning Dr. McPherson. And so the second traumatic experience in his early life was that he faced the auction block. And this would have been a common occurrence in this time period. Once a slaveholder passed away, his assets were then up for bid, meaning this would be inheritance for his children. And so inheritance could be in the shape of land, and it could be in the form of enslaved people. And so that's what happened with Dr. McPherson, was all of his estate was put up for auction. All the enslaved people went on the auction block. And what you're looking at here at the top, this is an inventory of, I'm going to have to try to get this name right. It's Dr. Josiah Henson McPherson. Now, we know Josiah Henson was named after his owner. And in the book he's referred to as Dr. Josiah Henson McPherson. It's a mouthful. So we think this is the same individual, and it's two reasons. I couldn't put the whole inventory in here, but his inventory includes an extensive list of medical paraphernalia and books, and we know Dr. McPherson was a physician. The other reason why we think this is our guy is because if you look at the inventory here, you see the names of enslaved people on this plantation. And as you go down, you see Celia, John, and Cy. And we know from Henson's narrative his nickname was Cy. We also know he had an older brother named John. And we also know when Josiah Henson and his wife Charlotte had children, one of the daughters was named Celia. So this is an educated guess. We feel relatively confident this is the right person. The only thing that doesn't quite jive is the date of 1805, because Henson's narrative describes that he was here in Montgomery County by 1795. So the timing's off a little bit, but we know there was a Dr. McPherson in Rockville who actually helped survey the town of Rockville. And we've tried to figure out this connection between Riley and McPherson. Why would he want to go all the way to Charles County to purchase an enslaved person when he could have gone to Alexandria or somewhere much closer than Charles County? And we think they may have known each other. But these are scenes from an auction scene. And when you read Henson's narrative, if you haven't read it, I hope that you will. And one of the most emotional scenes in it is when Henson's mother is begging and pleading Isaac Riley not to separate her from her son. It's really traumatic. So at that auction, Josiah's mother was purchased by Isaac Riley, and that's the man who owned the plantation that we have here in Montgomery County. Josiah was purchased by Adam Robb, who was a tavern keeper in Rockville. And what you're looking at here is an image done by Benjamin Latrobe from 1811 in Rockville. And I remember the first time that I saw this, I actually thought this was the Isaac Riley house because it looks so similar to what the house looks like on our property. So it gives you a good visual. It's an architectural consistency. Most plantation owners in this time period did not have huge mansions like you think from Gone with the Wind and Tara. They would have had more moderately sized tidewater homes here in the area. But once Josiah came here, he became ill, and he was really suffering being separated from his mother. And Adam Robb knew that he wasn't long for this world, so he approached Isaac Riley and said, "I'd like to make a deal. I'd like you to take Josiah, and if he lives, in return, I just need you to put some horseshoes on my horse," because Isaac Riley was a blacksmith, and if he dies, then we're square. And it's over a handshake agreement. And we know that Josiah Henson lived until 1883, so being reunited with his mother apparently was the medicine that he needed. So in Henson's narrative, he talks extensively about work conditions. And if you read the quotes here, hopefully they'll be up here long enough for you to read them. Work was age appropriate in this time period for enslaved people. And he talks about at a very early age he was put to work. There's no playtime when you're enslaved. It doesn't matter what your age is. And quickly over time, it becomes apparent to Isaac Riley that Henson is a very good worker, trustworthy worker. And so eventually he's upgraded to the position of superintendent or overseer on the Riley plantation. One of the other things he talks about extensively in the book is food, believe it or not. And he talks about here on the Riley plantation, if you were enslaved, your typical diet included salted herrings, cornmeal, and whatever vegetables you grew in your truck patch. So a very limited diet. So when Henson became the overseer on this plantation, he took it upon himself to aid the enslaved people, his peers on the plantation. And one way that he would do that was he would take it upon himself at nighttime. He would take a stray chicken out in the woods, and he would kill it, and he would feed it to the enslaved people. And he felt like he was doing the morally the right thing because he was giving the enslaved people what they needed. And it was also equally helping Isaac Riley because they were healthy, they were nourished, they could work harder. He also talks about living conditions on this plantation. And as you read the description, he talks about how they lived in a village of log huts. And based on what he wrote and the numbers that we know, we think probably at most there would have been 3 slave quarters on this plantation. None of them are standing today. We know that they were torn down by the mid-1950s, so they survived for quite a long time. The image that you're looking at is a slave quarter at Edge Hill, which is in Laytonsville section of the county, just to give you an idea of what it could have looked like. Unfortunately, we don't know, but we are doing archaeology to help figure out where the quarters would have been and perhaps their size. But when you read his description, you recognize there's no room for privacy in that setting. There's no room for a healthy environment. You're going to be sick all the time. It's just a terrible condition to be in. When Henson turned 18 years old, his mother asked him to attend a camp revival meeting that took part at Newport Mill, which is in Kingar, and that's also at one of our parks here in Montgomery County. And he was very hesitant to attend this because he did not want to have to ask Isaac Riley to go. He was very afraid the reaction that he would get from Riley, but he actually agreed and let him go. And so Henson attended this meeting, and it was a spiritual awakening for him. If you were enslaved back then, and if you attended church, and often enslaved people had to attend the same church that their master went to, they would hear sermons about obedience and loyalty to their master. Instead, at the camp meeting that he went to, he heard about salvation. And it was the first time that Henson learned that God wanted to give salvation to everyone. It wasn't reserved just for the planter class. It was for everyone, regardless of your race and your wealth. And that really spoke to him. And eventually this would become his profession, but this was a major turning point for him. And it really pushed him in a way where his moral compass was always his guide. He never really deviated one way or the other. He always just kept a straight, narrow path. So some of the crops that Henson would have been dealing with here on the plantation was initially was tobacco, which was grown here in Montgomery County. Eventually, farmers made the switch to wheat and corn because A, it wasn't as rough on the soil, and it also didn't require as much labor. It just wasn't as intensive. And these are crops that Henson would have grown, and in addition to that, he would have grown oats, barley, potato, corn, all these kind of market goods, and it was his responsibility to take all of Riley's products and take them to Georgetown and sell them at the market. And you have to keep in mind in this time period, most enslaved people did not venture more than 10 miles away from the plantation. So for him to have the slave pass in hand and the ability to go to Georgetown, where at this time there was a significant free black population, he's starting to get a taste and an understanding of what freedom can be. And as you read the rest of his quote, when he would come back to the plantation, he was never rewarded for his work. And he talked constantly about Riley being an oppressive person, and he never rewarded Henson for his hard work. So in addition to being an overseer, being in that position meant he had to serve as the manservant for Isaac Riley, and that's what we would consider a bodyguard today. And one of the recreational activities men of the planter class would participate in this time period was to go to the taverns and have spirits and talk about this and that. Well, eventually, the more you drink, you're more likely to get into some altercations and for some fights. And so it would have been Henson's responsibility to basically to step in for Riley and fight his fights. And one of those times that it occurred was with Bryce Linton, and that's the man that you see there. Linton was the overseer for George Riley, and George Riley was Isaac Riley's older brother. and he had a plantation in Rockville. Well, Bryce Linton was not happy about this fight, and he vowed revenge. And so not long after, Henson was making his way back to Isaac Riley's plantation, and he came across Bryce Linton and some enslaved laborers. And they basically jumped on him. And Linton took a fence post and broke Henson's shoulder blades, and it left him maimed for life. And to give you a visual of what that means is the late John McCain, how he was unable to raise his arms. That's what happened to Josiah Henson as well. And another point about Bryce Linton, just to keep in mind, and we'll get into this more with Harriet Beecher Stowe, when she developed her book, a lot of the characters were based on real people here in Montgomery County. So Bryce Linton was a model for Simon Legree from Uncle Tom's Cabin. So by 1824, Isaac Riley is in a lot of legal mess, and he's involved in 2 separate cases with family members. And he knows that he's pretty much doomed, that the court is going to foreclose on his property. And in this time period property, again, it's not just land, it's all your assets, including your enslaved laborers. So Riley decides that he is going to ask Josiah Henson to lead the majority of the enslaved laborers on his plantation, and he wants them to go to Kentucky where his brother lives. And Henson was shocked, and he could not believe in his wildest dreams that he would ask a black man to lead 22 enslaved people from Montgomery County, Maryland, all the way to the western edge of Kentucky. And when you really think about it, it really wasn't a choice for Henson. He knew if he didn't agree to do this, the odds were his family would be split up. So he went, and they left in February of 1825, and they made the journey from Montgomery County, Maryland, all the way to number 2 on the map, which is Davis County, Kentucky, to the town of Owensboro. And as you look at that path, you should recognize that they're crossing over the Mason-Dixon line. And this is in 1825. So they come across free blacks in Ohio. And they asked Josiah, I'm paraphrasing this, of course, why are you going? Why don't you just run? This is your opportunity. You can just blend right in. No one's going to notice you. But because Henson was so morally correct, he just could not deviate. He felt like he had made an agreement with Isaac Riley, and he was going to lead those people all the way to Kentucky. And this is the plantation that you're looking at here in Owensboro. A much larger plantation than what Isaac Riley had here in Montgomery County. And here, Henson continued to work as overseer on that property. So between 1825 and 1828, Henson worked towards becoming an ordained minister in the Methodist Episcopal Church. And he spent a lot of time in Cincinnati. Again, he's around free blacks who keep saying, well, this is your opportunity, but instead he wants to do it what he considered the ethically correct way, and that's to purchase his freedom. And the only way that you can do that in this time period is you have to buy your manumission, and that takes money. So he started preaching, and he accumulated the funds, and then he decided he had enough money, he would go back to Montgomery County, Maryland, and talk to Isaac Riley and tell him what he wanted to do. So he came back to Maryland by himself. He left his family back in Kentucky, and he actually made an arrangement with Isaac Riley to get his manumission. So for $450, they came to an arrangement that the Freedom Papers would be issued, and that's what you're looking at here. On the left is the actual document that was registered in the Montgomery County land records. And if you think it's weird that it's in the land records, just keep in mind they're considered property. So that's where they're going to put a document, or bill of sale that include human beings is in the land records in this time period. But that's the official document. The one on the right is the actual freedom paper that would have been given to the newly freed, formerly enslaved person. And I know it's hard to read, it gives a very vivid physical description of the formerly enslaved person, and that is intentional. Because if a white person approached you and said, I need to see your papers, they could verify that you are in fact the person that this document is for. And you carried that on your body at all times. It was critical. It was a matter of between freedom and enslavement. A very important document. And the woman that you see there in the corner is his daughter, Julia Henson Wheeler. And they kept that document well after Henson died. This article was published in 1913 in an unidentified Michigan newspaper. I wish I could tell you the source. I've been trying to figure that out for a very long time. But thankfully, Peerless Rockville has a photocopy of that article, and that's where it comes from. But at any rate, Henson, he thinks he's made a deal, everything's square. And before he leaves, Isaac Riley says, you know what, I've got a really good idea. Instead of you carrying around with that document in your hand, I'm going to give you a slave pass so you can go back to Kentucky. Why don't you let me take your freedom paper and wrap it up in some letters, and I will seal it with my mark, and you put it in your bag, and you take it back, and no one's going to ask you to see it, and no one can open it because it's got my seal on it. So Henson thinks, he's really looking out for me. He's being generous. And so he makes the journey back to Kentucky, and he meets up with Charlotte, and she's panicky, and she says, how are you going to raise the rest of the $650 you need for your freedom? And Henson's like, whoa, 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 no, that's not the deal. And she tells him what had happened is that Isaac had wrote his brother Amos and said, when Henson arrives, take the letters and don't give him the freedom papers until he raises the additional $650, which would have taken forever. It would have taken a very long time. So when Henson goes to talk to Amos Riley, and Riley asked him for the papers, Henson's response is, I haven't seen them. I don't know where they're at. They might be at the Landing. I haven't seen them since I was in Louisville. So Amos sends him back to Landing, and Henson, it's one of my favorite lines in the whole book. He says, of course I couldn't find the papers. But he had them. He still had them. He gave them to Charlotte, so he still had them, thank goodness. But after that occurred, Isaac Riley then again wrote his brother and said, I need you to sell all my enslaved laborers except Henson and his family. So all those people that he carried all the way from Maryland to Kentucky, they're now sold to the Deep South. And he's very fearful at this point. It's really only a matter of time before that happens to his own family. And so that comes about, that question becomes almost a reality by 1829. And Amos Riley tells Henson, I would like you to go to New Orleans with my son. I want you to take all the produce and products from this plantation and take it down to New Orleans. And Henson sees the writing on the wall. So he tells Charlotte, I need you to sew the manumission papers into my clothing, and I'm going to have it on my body. But he knows it's very likely this will be the last time he's going to see his family. And so they make their way down the Mississippi River. They stop in Vicksburg. He sees all those enslaved people that were his peers on the plantation. And he knows, seeing their condition, they're hungry, they have diseases, they're humiliated, they're at death's door. He realizes he cannot do that. He will not survive. And he decides at that moment in time he's going to kill Amos Riley Jr. and all the crew on the boat. But that moral compass, it brings him back. He gets centered again. He says, I can't do it. I can't live with myself. I just can't do it. I have to let this be in God's hands, and it will work out the way it's supposed to. And this is Amos Riley Jr. He was 18 when they went on the boat trip, so this was significantly after this tintype was done. So Amos Riley Jr., he basically begs Henson and says, I need you to take me back to Kentucky. And so he's saved. I feel like I missed a point here. Let me go back. Isaac Riley becomes very sick with what he called river fever, which we would call probably malaria today. And so instead of being traded at the auctions in New Orleans, Riley begs Henson to take him back to Kentucky. So they make that journey all the way back to the plantation. And Henson is convinced once they get back that the Riley family is going to say, you know, you've been so loyal, you've always done the right thing, you deserve your freedom. That does not happen. So at that point, he decides it's time to have a conversation with his wife, Charlotte, and that's who you see over there to the left. A real conversation about what are we going to do, because it's time. We have to have this talk. And I'm a mother, and I know after asking you how many parents are in this room, I know there's a lot of mothers. And you can imagine if you were in the position, if your husband came to you and said, it's time to make a 700-mile journey. We don't have a map. We have very little money. We don't know anyone north of Kentucky. And we have 4 young children. 2 of them are infants. You might think, I'm not really sure this is a great idea. I'm afraid. I don't know what to do. So in response to Charlotte, Henson says, well, here's the deal. I'm leaving without you, and I'm taking all the kids with me. So that changed her mind. She then relented and said, all right, we're going to go. And so they left on a Saturday and made their way on the Underground Railroad. And they did have help along the way, as many freedom seekers did on the Underground Railroad. They received assistance from Native Americans, from Quakers, and certainly from free black communities. And they made their way all the way to Canada in 1830. That's 700 miles that they did. And you can see the trajectory here from where they went from number 2 all the way to number 7. And just so you know, Henson not only himself was a freedom seeker, he ultimately later on in life came back as an Underground Railroad conductor. And we know he aided at least 118 other formerly enslaved African Americans to make their way from the United States to Canada. And he did talk extensively about that in his slave narrative, which was uncommon in this time period, to be very open about the details of the Underground Railroad, because it basically survived based on secrecy. So it really is an important document for us to know what that experience was like from the vantage point of the person on the Underground Railroad. So the Henson family made their way to Canada. His first wife, Charlotte, passed away, and he remarried to Nancy Henson, who also had been born in Maryland. She may have been enslaved. We're still trying to figure that out, but she was also a Maryland native. And this was the home that they built in Dresden, the church where Josiah Henson preached at. And this is not his sawmill. This is actually a sawmill in Maryland, but I wanted to give you a visual so you could see that was his profession, preaching and being a miller. And he was very good at that. And he also was a very benevolent-minded person. He wanted every freedom seeker that made their way to Canada to have the same opportunities that he had, that they could be their own master and have their own home and have a job. And he knew the only way that that could happen was if they had an education. So he worked to building the British American Institute, and that's where formerly enslaved African Americans could receive an industrial education. And you've probably heard that term before if you've taken American history and you've learned about Booker T. Washington, because that's what he did at Tuskegee. But that's what Henson was doing at the Dawn settlement years before. And Dawn is the area that's circled there in the red. But this whole map gives you an idea of where free black communities were concentrated in Lower Canada. And Canada really was a place that you wanted to go. When he was in Cincinnati, they didn't tell him, like, you should just settle in Ohio or Indiana. They said, you need to go to Canada. Because at this point, not only in the United States do you have the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 that did require any apprehended freedom seeker to be sent back to their plantation owner. In Canada, this section of Canada, they would not extradite freedom seekers back to the United States. So this was the one place where you did not have to look over your shoulder if you went to. And that's why they told him that's where you need to go. So now we get to his narrative. So by 1849, he's still thinking about all the African Americans that are still enslaved here in the United States, including his brother John, who's still here in Montgomery County in Rockville. And he had tried to get his brother to run on the Underground Railroad. And a moment ago, I was talking about the dilemma. He decided, it's not for me. I don't want to do it. I'm not going to do it. So Henson decides the only way he can get his brother out of the country is to pay for his manumission. And he started thinking, well, how am I going to raise the funds to do that? So he has a conversation with the Boston Anti-Slavery Society, and they come to a mutual kind of agreement that they can help each other. And one way of doing that is he could write about what it was like to be enslaved in the Upper South, and they could use that as a tool to educate Americans about the plight of the enslaved, particularly in the Upper South. And in turn, he could take the revenue generated from the narrative and purchase his brother's freedom. And he definitely did that. And his manumission record is in the land records at the State Archives for Montgomery County. And many people read his book before it had any affiliation to Uncle Tom's Cabin. But the person who read it and had the most direct impact from his words and his memories is this woman, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who ultimately wrote her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. And this book had such a profound impact. How many people have read Uncle Tom's Cabin? Okay, not everyone. And I will admit, I didn't read Uncle Tom's Cabin until I was working on my PhD. I made it all the way from high school all the way to that point and was never assigned to read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the only reason I read it was I had to do an exhibit on the Underground Railroad, and I felt like, I need to read this book, it's time. But back when this book was published, it was incredibly popular. And there was only one other book that you were more likely to find in an American household in this time period. Any guesses? The Bible. Okay, so that gives you an idea of how popular this book was and how illuminating and educational it was for people who had no clue what was going on in the South. But she definitely had her critics, and people thought her story, it just could not be true. There was no way it could be this bad. And so she decided, a year after she published Uncle Tom's Cabin, to publish a key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, basically to dispute the naysayers and say, here are the facts. This is where all my information came from. And she literally goes through each character of that book and says, here's the source. So when you get to Uncle Tom, the last person she talks about is Josiah Henson. It's a very long section of her book. So if you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's great. If you haven't read The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, that's another book you should pick up and read. But once that came out, if people didn't know who Josiah Henson was, they did after that. So that gets us to the term of Uncle Tom. So for the folks who haven't read Uncle Tom's Cabin, the original character that Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote was a young, courageous, brave man, a hard worker, very religious, and he became a martyr because he died trying to protect two other enslaved women on the plantation. The characteristics that we would want to link, and certainly can link, to Josiah Henson. But because Harriet Beecher Stowe did not put a copyright on her novel, it gave people the ability to change who Uncle Tom was. And not so much in the book format, but in media. And a lot of people in this time period, if they didn't read the book, they certainly saw the plays and the musicals. And so their understanding of Uncle Tom is not what Harriet Beecher Stowe originally intended. So we move from this original Uncle Tom to what people know of and think of today, the slur, the old, decrepit, subservient, happy-go-lucky man. And that is so far from what Stowe intended and what Henson really was in his time. And how timely is the image of Mickey Mouse? You know, you think this conversation about blackface, you think that's only in the Jim Crow area, and clearly it's not. I mean, we're having constant conversations about that right now in Virginia. So that term has such a lasting impact, and it's one of the most important things we'll tackle at the Josiah Henson Museum. So Josiah Henson, because of his narrative and because of his affiliation to the novel, he became an international celebrity. He was incredibly famous in the 19th century. So in 1851, he met Queen Victoria for the first time. First time, if you can believe that. He was asked to represent Canada at the World Industrial Fair, which was in London. Can you imagine going from a slave quarter in Montgomery County to this large, grandiose building in London? I don't know that I've ever seen anything like that in my own lifetime now, But he went there and he overheard a conversation that Queen Victoria had with one of her aides, and she said, "Is that the fugitive slave I read about?" So she had read his book before she knew he was tied to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So then you move forward in time to 1877. She asked him to come visit her at her residence so she can have a meeting with him. And when he comes, she introduces him to all of her staff as Uncle Tom. So that alliance, that affiliation is pretty concrete at this time point. So Queen Victoria kept extensive journals about her day-to-day being. And when she met Josiah Henson at that meeting in 1877, she wrote about him and about his narrative. So you fast forward in time to 2011 when President Obama, our first African-American president, goes to visit Queen Elizabeth. She asked her archival staff to bring out things that she thinks would be of interest to President Obama. She breaks out the journal and has it on the page where Queen Victoria talks about meeting Josiah Henson. He's still incredibly relevant. So after that trip to England, he comes back to the United States for a trip. His first stop is the White House. I mean, where else would he go? So he goes to the White House to have a visit with President Rutherford Hayes. And then this time period, it would have been social etiquette for you to have a letter of introduction or reference for you to meet someone of his stature. And the person that wrote that for him was Frederick Douglass. An interesting note, he talks in this letter that Henson is known as the original Uncle Tom, and scholars believe Frederick Douglass was the first person to use Uncle Tom as a slur. So that's an interesting tidbit that we'll talk about at the museum. But this is an example of one of the panels that we're going to do at the museum, and I'll talk more about the exhibits in a moment. But it's just to give you an idea of what the Riley Plantation looked like when he came back in 1878. It was in major disarray when he came back. It was nothing like he remembered from his youth, from 1828. So Henson passed away in 1883. He had a very large family. Probably more than what I'm giving credit here for on this slide, but you see images of his son, his grandchildren. The image in the middle is the Josiah Henson family reunion we had at the site this past summer, and we had probably 100 individuals come out, and a lot of his family still does live in Canada, and they still made the trek down here. They've been heavily involved in the museum efforts. That's been really important to us to have their involvement. And you know, their legacy and their involvement of keeping his story alive, that's been going on forever, since 1883. They have kept themselves involved. They have a Facebook page on their family history, and anyone can join it. And I'll admit, I go on it all the time because they're constantly doing research, and I ask questions all the time, and they've been amazing. But his tombstone and his house, which is now a museum, became like a Mecca or a pilgrimage site. He is an incredibly important Canadian to their history. And so people go there all the time. I actually heard the other day they're thinking about changing the name from the Uncle Tom's Cabin historic site to Josiah Henson. So they're actually thinking about making the name change. So that gets us to this slide. I came across this years ago, and I couldn't figure out if the typesetter just didn't get it right or put in the wrong letters. But by 1930, unfortunately, here in the United States, not in Canada, but here in the United States, people have really forgotten about Josiah Henson, perhaps because of his affiliation with the term Uncle Tom. And in this year, 1934, the Schoenberg Center at the New York Public Library did an exhibit on Josiah Henson. And even in that little blurb, they still tie him to Uncle Tom. And that's something that we're trying to fight at our museum, is we want people to recognize that he was a real person with significant achievements. And he was not a fictional character, and he did so much more than just aid Harriet Beecher Stowe. And that's what we're trying to do at our museum. The other thing we're really trying to fight is we have a lot of competition in Maryland. When you talk about abolitionists and civil rights movement, this is the state. They were from Maryland. We have Frederick Douglass and we have Harriet Tubman. But all the attributes that you can link to Frederick Douglass, for example, an author, an Underground Railroad conductor, a freedom seeker, those are the same things that we could say about Josiah Henson. And when I took this picture, I was with my daughter, and it says celebrating Frederick Douglass, son of Maryland. I so badly just want to have a little makeshift panel that says Josiah Henson, the other son of Maryland, because we want people to know about him and know about his achievements. So this is how we got started with the museum. When I came on board in 2008, they had just finished the document there on the right. That's the historic structure report for the site. That's heavily architectural, so it's not as much meat and bones on history, but it was a start. And between all the primary sources tied to Henson in this document, I've kind of built upon that to get the research necessary we need to interpret the site, to give tours, and to do the museum exhibits. The other guide that we use is the Josiah Henson facility plan that was approved by the Planning Board in 2010. And I'm sure it's hard to read, but we have this little bubble diagram where it's different themes that we want to talk about, and Henson is our filter to be able to discuss that, not only for him, but all the enslaved population here in Montgomery County. And both of those documents are online if you want to see those later. So, I hope when you leave here tonight, if you had called the site Uncle Tom's Cabin before, that you will not do that anymore. We've actually called ourselves Mythbusters because we have spent over 10 years trying to tell the public you should not call this property Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what we call it right now is the Riley Bolton House, and that's not a really sexy name, but we put the house on the National Register. And if you're not familiar with how that procedure works, those folks are primarily interested in architectural history. So when we made the pitch for this site, we felt the compelling story was Josiah Henson. I mean, I think you would agree. They didn't agree with us. They thought the architectural history was the primary story and Henson was secondary. So that's how the name came about. We did not pick that name. The Riley family built the house circa 1800 to 1815, and that's Matilda Riley. She was the plantation mistress that lived here in this house. And then the Bolton part comes from the lady that you see standing in front of the log kitchen, Lavinia Bolton. Her and her husband bought this house, and between 1936 and 39, they hired the White House architect, Lorenzo Winslow, to restore this house. So you can kind of see why MHT said we think that story is important as well. But they did make some alterations to the house, but at any rate, that's why we call it Riley Bolton House. So that's one reason why we don't want you to call it Uncle Tom's Cabin. The other reason, more importantly, is it's just not truthful, because Josiah Henson never lived in this building, okay? And the reason why we know that is that the building that you see today, meaning the logs from the foundation up, they date from 1850, and Henson was gone from this site by 1828. And we came to that date because we did dendrochronology, and that's where they take like a dime-sized core sample from the logs and do chemistry, and I can't explain that. But they know that the wood was cut down in 1850 to build the structure. And we also have an insurance policy from 1856 when Matilda Riley took a policy out, and it says that the log kitchen was in good repair. So presumably, it was a relatively new building. We've also done extensive archaeology, and I don't include me in the we. We have 2 archaeologists, and we have a huge volunteer corps. I mean, they're amazing, and I don't know if any of them are here tonight, but they are amazing men and women who help us out immensely at this site. They have uncovered at least 3 earlier earthen floors. So it is possible prior to 1850, there was a different kitchen still standing on that foundation or footprint. And the likelihood of that is because we've unearthed artifacts that would date from that time period: buttons, ceramics, food remains, toys, things that you would expect to see from a log kitchen. And typically on a slave plantation, the person who lived in a kitchen was the person working in the kitchen. So the enslaved cook is usually a female. It would have been her and her family that lived in this building. Now, Henson did say when he came back in 1828, he stayed in a log kitchen. But this building that you see today is not the same one. Okay. So now you've seen our site, and you can tell it's incredibly small, and we have an incredibly small budget. I do want to say our county council has been so wonderful to help fund this site. But we have to take that money and make it stretch as far as we can. And in a really tight space, you have to, every little thing counts. And so when the site opens, visitors will come in the rear of the house just as the enslaved would have done in this time period. And you'll make your way into what is now the 1930s kitchen. It will be completely gutted. It will be a new museum space. This will not be a house museum. So if you're expecting to come here and see how the master lived in 1800, you will not get that experience. There are literally 2 pieces of furniture in the entire building, and that's it. The rest of this is exhibits. So you'll come through the west wing, you'll make your way through the dining room, study, living room, south wing, and every exhibit you will come across will be tied to Henson. It's 100% about Josiah Henson. You'll exit the building, and then you'll walk around and come into the log kitchen again through the rear, and that is where you'll have a living history experience. You'll see what it was like to cook in a kitchen in this time period. So a little bit about the exhibits. I know I've kind of peppered a few teasers to show you what the exhibit's like. So the idea that was pitched to us by Brown, who's our exhibit design team, if you've not heard of them, they're wonderful. Their specialty is African American museums. They just did all the exhibits at Montpelier. If you've read about that in the Washington Post, they're the team that did that. And we're incredibly lucky they came on this project. They pitched the idea that we would have, they call them separate voices. Not to sound like we're crazy, it makes sense. So there's a Henson voice, and there are other voices we're going to talk about. So the primary voice that you're going to hear through the house is Josiah Henson. And their idea was that the text will only be 50 words. So anyone who's wrote an interpretive panel, 50 words or less, it makes you incredibly nervous because you think, what are you going to get out of 50 words? And when they told me that, I said, nope. Our interpretive signs were allowed 300 words, but they said, nope, we need to cut the text down. We need to let Henson do his own talking. So every panel will have all of his quotes. Those on the side and below him, those are his words, because his words are more important than anything that I'm going to say. So we want you to leave there reading his words. And we also wanted the visuals to be very compelling. So if you're not familiar with this type of style, it's called the graphic novel approach. And when they pitched this to us, I have to admit I was a little leery because I thought, I don't know how this is going to go over. But then I remember when I worked at a library with the younger audience, and our primary audience has been and will always be school groups. They're our target audience. We have to appeal to them so they get the objective of this museum. And we knew that this would work. And we know that because when they go to the library, those are the books that they check out. If you haven't seen the new Spider-Man movie, go watch it. I took my 6-year-old to it. I took her to see Mary Poppins. She could not sit still, I took her to see Spider-Man 2. She did not move for 2 hours. There is something about this illustration style, and this is the man who's our illustrator, did all the custom work. His name's Kyle Baker. I don't know what it is, it just works. And so that's the approach we went with. And you can see the images kind of speak for themselves. They provoke the fear, the emotions, everything that Josiah experienced in his lifetime. The other voice is Park's voice, and this is the more typical, frankly, it may be boring, voice you would expect at a museum, but we have to do that. There are some facts we need to share with the public. We want to share where the research came from, whether it's from archival documents or from archaeology or oral history. You're still going to have custom art illustrations. The one up top is a reproduction of what we think the plantation looked like, and that's based off archaeology, aerial photography, maps. We're not 100% sure because we only own 4 acres He owns 700 acres of land, so we don't know. So this is an educated guess. And these are the panels that you'll see not only in the house, but also on the grounds. And lastly, we have what we call architectural sidebars. Now, we anticipate most people that come here are coming because they want to learn about Josiah Henson. But we recognize there will be people who come in and are also interested in the house and its fabric. And a lot of that fabric has been changed over time. So in strategic places throughout the house, we'll either point out, you know, this was here in 1800, or this, in this case, the box staircase that was originally there in 1800 was removed. But this is what it would have looked like, just so people have an idea. And when folks come here, we want you to know, of course, you know, the primary focus is Josiah Henson, but he was one of 22 other enslaved men, women, children on this plantation. So we're talking about everybody to the best of our ability. And we're using the tools that every museum that talks about slavery uses. We're using archaeology, oral history, and archival records. And I'm just going to point out the two at the bottom. The page over to the right or to the left, that's from the Riley Bible. And in his Bible, they not only documented births, deaths, marriages of the white family members, they did the same for the enslaved community. So we do have some documentation of enslaved people from that document. And then as you move forward in time, this is from 1864. The center document is the slave statistics of 1864. It was actually done in 1867, but it was an enumeration of all the enslaved people that were still on a plantation in 1864. So we know that the Raleigh family had enslaved laborers up until this time the state mandated emancipation in the state of Maryland. And it has their names, their full names, not just their first name, also their last name. So we will also have a new visitor center, and when you go there, there's things you will expect. We'll have an orientation film. You'll pay for your admission there. There's restrooms. There's a gift shop we hope that you will come in and look around at. Because this is a public park meeting, we're open from sun up to sundown. We don't want to exclude people who come, let's say at, I don't know, 6:07 in December. We have exhibits on the exterior of the building that will give you a bio about Josiah Henson, and perhaps will appease you to come back when we're open, regular business hours, but we don't want anyone to leave without getting some understanding of Josiah Henson. And this is the view of what the visitor center will look from the back side of the plantation. So this is the larger site plan. This is the visitor center over here on the left-hand corner, and there's the Raleigh Bolton House. That big open space, we've been doing archaeology there for years. And so we have strategically placed interpretive panels that discuss some of the things that we found underground. For example, we're fairly confident we found the overseer's house. And we're fairly confident, because Josiah Henson was the overseer on this plantation, that he potentially lived in that building. So when you come there, you will learn about things that we have uncovered, sites that Josiah Henson would have certainly seen when he was enslaved on this plantation. And we eventually hope that we do own acreage further back than this now. We could not include that in this phase because, frankly, we don't have the money. So the next phase of this project, hopefully, we'll be able to add more in the further rear. We know the property that's on the back side there. We know from aerial photography that's where the bulk of the buildings are at. So we're eventually hopeful that the ground is not so disturbed that we can find these buildings. Also, I want to point this out just to give you a heads up. When we originally designed this property, we had a very nice parking lot. And you know, museums need parking lots. We found out after we went through design, there's a champion dogwood tree in that parking lot. So in Montgomery County, that means we cannot cut it down. So our parking lot has changed from a very nice parking lot to 3 spaces. So to compensate for that, we've had to build a parking garage at Wall Local Park. And it's about a block walk, but we we want you to be excited. We know it's a little bit of a walk. As you make the walk from Wall Local Park along Old Georgetown Road, we will have signage along the way to get you ready and pumped about learning about Josiah Henson. And unfortunately, this is my last slide, and I have to be the bearer of bad news that the site is closed until 2020. We're actually breaking ground next week for construction, and after working on this since 2008, I'm very, very excited to be in the position to tell you that even though we really want you to come, we're at the position right now where we can bring the programs to you. So if you're affiliated with a school or a church or any house of worship or any organization that wants to learn about Josiah Henson, we can bring our educators to you. And also in the meantime, we've published a book on Josiah Henson. And I also don't have that tonight because it will not be available until the 18th, I found out. But I do want to tell you, if you do purchase the book, 100% of the proceeds go back to the museum. So if you buy the book, you're helping us make the museum a reality, and I want to thank you in advance if you do decide to do that. But I always say this when I give the talk about Josiah Henson. If you have not read his narrative, I would much rather you read his narrative than buy the book. You really need to start with his narrative. And you can get it free online 24/7 through the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. They have a program called Documenting the American South, and they have 3 of his 8 narratives online free of charge. And I hope that if you haven't read them by now, that you'll take the opportunity to do that. And thank you so much for having me. I don't know if I went over, I probably did, but thank you so much for having me. And I'm happy to answer questions. Yes, sir.
What's the cross street on Old Georgetown Road?
I believe that is, let me go, that's Tilden Lane. Yeah. And I will tell you, when we first started doing the museum design, we always have community meetings with Lux Manor and that whole area. And when they come to the meetings, the one and only concern that they have is traffic. And that happens with all of our parks, frankly. Everyone that lives around wants to know what the impact will be with traffic. And that's another reason why we have chosen not to put parking off Tilden Lane. I'm sure you're wondering, well, you've got these 2 properties right here. Why can't you just put it there? The neighbors would not like us, and we need them to be our allies because they are the eyes on that property for us when we're not there. And we want to be good neighbors, so we've decided that's not the place to put it. So for right now, we're going to have to put it at Wall Local Park. Yes, sir.
Let me run around here and I'll give you a mic. This is going to go on YouTube, so we want to be sure people online can hear you guys too. There you go.
Thanks. You mentioned, is it on?
I can hear you.
You mentioned the Newport Mill and his conversion experience at the Newport Mill. I grew up near there and actually went to Newport Mill Junior High School back in the day, and it's unfortunate. I hope Montgomery County Public Schools are a little better now, but we studied the Civil War at Newport Mill Junior High School. We never heard that Jubal Early marched down to Washington within about 200 yards of the school, or that Newport Mill was where it was, where the B&O tracks cross Rock Creek. Or anything at all about Josiah Henson. And I didn't know anything about him until 20 years later or so when I got interested in researching the history of where I grew up, and I found that Newport Mill itself, and I hope you can link to it, has a really interesting history. And among the things that I learned about Newport Mill was that Josiah Henson not only had that conversion experience, the church, as I understand it, stood where the recreation center now is, on the hill right above Rock Creek and Beach Drive that goes through there. And that when he came back from Britain, and I wonder whether you've run across this, because I'm not positive my memory is right about this, but my understanding was he was a preacher and he was famous in the community. Everybody knew he was from there. When he came back from Britain and visited Hayes at the White House, he went back to that church and preached and drew a huge crowd of mixed African Americans former enslaved people and white people from the area and preached to them. So
I did not know that.
I
That's
don't know if I can
interesting.
track down my source for that, but I hope I can, and I'll
I
try to
hope you
get it to
can.
you. I hope you can link to it. And the other thing that might be worth mentioning is that during the New Deal, the Roosevelt area, there was a project to document the history of enslaved people in Montgomery County.
Right.
And there are wonderful accounts. There's particularly an account of a woman who was enslaved in the Forest Glen area, where she talks about, just north of Forest Glen, where she talks about life living very close to where Josiah Henson lived. And I hope that in time you might be able to link in the museum to the documentation of other enslaved people, because there are records and narratives of other people who lived in that area.
That's a good point. We actually have included as many enslaved people that we know about on the plantation into the exhibits. We actually do have a panel specifically on the enslaved laborers. And again, our focus is Henson, but we don't want to ignore the other laborers who are on this plantation. And two things I wanted to respond to. I brought this image up because I didn't talk about this at the time, but you refreshed my memory. So when Lavinia Bolton purchased the house after it went through the restoration, the Washington Post, not the Washington Post, the Evening Star did an article about the restoration, and she talked about one of Riley's grandchildren came by and said, you know, everybody knows that Uncle Si lived here. And so it was like, and she said people have come and visited, they've knocked on the door and said, I've read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I know about Josiah Henson, and I know that this is where he lived. And that was in the 1930s. So even then there was a established kind of local lore that it was Uncle Tom's Cabin. The other point, Newport Mill, because I have to plug our sites, so that's part of my job too. So Woodlawn Barn, or rather, this is the barn at Woodlawn Museum. I call it Woodlawn Barn because for a long time it was supposed to be the Woodlawn Barn Visitor Center, and they kept changing the name. But this property was owned by William Palmer, and his wife was Clara DeVille, or Duval. And the Duval family owned the Newport Mill. And it's such a small world in the antebellum period. Everybody's kin to everybody in Montgomery County.
Yeah,
but
I lived on Duval land, and the other thing that's interesting too is that Kengar itself was a freedmen's community.
Right.
So later, for whatever reason, I don't know whether there was a connection to Duval, there was actually a group of houses near where I grew up, near a little creek that ran into Rock Creek that we all knew in the area where it was the homes of the enslaved people for the Duval plantation, which was near Veers Mill Road and where Rock Creek, down from where Rock Creek crosses Veers Mill Road. But then, for whatever reason, and it might have had something to do with Duval, or more likely with the B&O Railroad having cheap land,
Right.
that drew a lot of freedmen right after the Civil War, and that community is still an African-American community in Kensington. Those people went to Albert Einstein High School, where I went.
Well, thank you for sharing all that information. I'm very intrigued on the first part. I hope you will follow up with me if you find it.
And Jamie, you need to plug your book. I didn't get the title and where people can find it after it's distributed.
Well, I really do not like plugging myself. I'm only doing this because my boss is going to kill me if I don't. And again, all the proceeds go back to the museum. So if you purchase it, that would make me incredibly happy to know that you're helping the museum. It's called Sharp Flashes of Lightning Come from Black Clouds, and I'm sure you're wondering where in the world did you get that title, because it's a long one. But I went through Henson's narrative, and I wanted to pick a quote that I thought kind of stood out, and so I'll read the entire quote. It's sharp flashes of lightning come from black clouds, sprightly words of wit come from those who live in dark hovels, and bright gleams of intelligence come from children brought up in the most abject ignorance of books. So for someone to go from being illiterate to being a published author is really amazing. Oh, where can you buy the book? So right now, if you go online to Montgomery County Parks, it's called the JosiahHensonSite.org. You can buy it. Right now, if you go to the park's website in Maryland, you can correct me if I'm wrong. We have stuff up for Black History Month anyway, and there's a page right there that will link you up to where you can buy it. But I think once...
They can purchase it online, and when they come in,
Yeah, if you buy it online, we will ship it to you once you put your order in. But once we get it in-house, we're going to sell it at the Woodlawn Museum, so another reason for you to come out and visit. And then once the park opens, we will sell it there as well. But beyond that, I don't deal with the money, thank God, at parks. So our museum manager, Cheryl Spicer, is in charge of that. Yeah.
Did he have an affiliation with Masonry? Because in one of the symbols there was a
He did. You have a very good eye. I don't know how you can see that on this slide. He did. He joined the Masons in Boston, and that's where his wife Nancy, that's where they met, was in Boston. Yep. Good eye. Very few people. I've only had one other person ask me about that.
But this is in Canada, right?
Correct. This is at his burial site is at his home, and it's now part of the museum in Ontario.
Is Matthew Henson the Arctic explorer, a descendant of Josiah?
I'm glad that you asked. I just did a presentation 2 days ago in Prince George's County, and it's inevitable that we get a question about his descendants, which makes me very happy that you asked that. And the answer is, I don't know. And the reason why I'll tell you that, I've asked different family members, and I've asked other genealogical experts, and some say yes and some say no. And I am not a genealogist. For any of you who have not done genealogy, it is incredibly hard. Those folks are really special people. They have patience like you would not believe. But I will tell you, I've worked on Henson's family tree, and this is, I even put it in here, it's a working draft. This is not by no means final, and it may have mistakes. I will not be surprised if it doesn't. But we were really happy that we were able to, learn that his father may have been named Mason. Speaking of Masons, the family believes that his dad's name was Mason. And one of the things that you'll note if you eventually read Henson's narrative are there's certain things that he chooses not to include in his narrative. And I always think about this when we talk about ourselves, we selectively decide what we want to share with the public and what we want to keep to ourselves. For whatever reason, he did not want to name his parents. He did not name any of his daughters, only his sons. And I have no idea why. I'm not 100% sure why he wouldn't have shared that information. But, this is perfect being on this page talking about their family. They are doing the genealogy, and I have regularly asked them for help because they are the experts, and they are Henson's legacy. His greatest legacy is not his narrative, it's his family. And they know more about him than anyone else in my mind. So they've helped me extensively on the family tree. But I'm hoping eventually we'll get a concrete answer on that tie, but I can only tell you right now I don't know, because there are literally two camps on that one. There's those that say yes and those that say no.
Any more questions? We got time for maybe one or two more.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So I'm a history student with UMBC at Shady Grove. I've got my
Awesome.
classmates as well.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. So as a history student, I guess I'm also taking Civil War history right now with Dr. Blair. She's the director of the public history program with UMBC. And we talk a lot about the African American components and like slavery and all the enslaved in Maryland and everything. So I'm wondering if you say you guys do talks or like, and if there's any internship opportunities. And
oh yes, please see me afterwards.
Okay.
I would love to have you guys do work for us. I think archaeology is great because it's so hands-on, but archival research, you really need someone who, I don't know how to say it, like they have the cat-like skills. Like I always tell people I'm a curious cat. Like you have to be really willing to be persistent because things don't easily just pop up. Yeah. And we've really been trying to get our site on the map in academia. And we're finally getting there. And I mean, beyond middle schoolers and high schoolers, we would like to have college students to be interested in the site, whether they're history majors or museum study majors, public history or archaeology. We love younger people. We'd love to give you opportunities. We'd love for you to write a thesis or a dissertation tied to Josiah Henson or anything about slavery here in Montgomery County. So yeah, please see me afterwards.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I just finished reading Uncle Tom's Cabin just last week,
Oh my.
and
Let me give you the mic. I think this will be our last question. Here you go.
and it was probably only because I finished reading a book by David McCullough, a historian, who was talking about great Americans, and the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of those great Americans that he showcased, and that encouraged me to read the book, which I just finished last week. So my question is, did she ever meet or speak with Josiah Henson?
I'm glad this is the last question because that is the most popular question we get at our site. There's not a tour that happens where people don't want to know how the two met. And that's a really interesting story because Henson didn't, after the 1849, the next edition came in 1858, and he didn't talk about meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe in that edition. He didn't acknowledge it until 1876. So this is a while after that. But Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the preface for that edition. And so both of them addressed that question multiple times. And in his narrative, he talks about that she did buy a copy of his book in Boston and she read it. And he also acknowledges that they met in Massachusetts, where she lived at the time. Harriet Beecher Stowe, for her part, answered letters for years where people asked about Uncle Tom and if she had met them. And I asked the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center in Connecticut, what was their opinion on the matter. And their belief is that the meeting did take place. And what we have at our disposal is what she wrote in letters that ended up in newspaper articles, and in addition to what he said. So our feeling is that the meeting did take place. Now, some scholars in the past have disputed that, but I mean, we have the letters, so that's our belief is that the two did meet. But she certainly, even if they didn't meet, she certainly read his narrative. That's very clear that happened. And it persuaded, he is one of multiple people that helped mold that character. I don't want people to leave to think he was the Uncle Tom, he was the only. There were multiple enslaved men that she either had narratives or she talked to them firsthand to gather their perception of what enslavement was like.
Of course, in the book, it wasn't Uncle Tom who made it to Canada, it was another slave.
Right. Well, that's the thing. That's where the connection between Henson and Uncle Tom kind of ends, is where both Henson and Uncle Tom both faced immense brutality. Henson endured and overcame the adversity, whereas Uncle Tom in the narrative passed away. So, and Josiah Henson wanted people to know. Eventually, he initially took that title on, and he said he was proud of that. But as he got further along in life, and as that term slowly changed in his own lifetime, he wanted to distance himself, and he would tell reporters, "My name is not Uncle Tom. It's Josiah. It has always been Josiah Henson." So initially, he accepted that alliance, and it was beneficial to him. But he recognized as time passed on that affiliation was problematic.
Thank you again.
Thank
and
you. Thanks
if
so
you guys,
much.
And one last plug for the city of Takoma Park, anyway, is if you want to learn about our other upcoming arts and culture events, we have our e-newsletter sign-up sheet in the back and also a brochure. So thank you all for coming. Have a good night.